Colt Brennigan's weathered hands crushed the auction notice as his blood turned to ice. There, printed in black ink beneath a list of livestock and farm equipment, was a name that made his heart stop. Evangeline Moorhaven, contract labor -5 years. The paper trembled in his grip as memories flooded back, Evangeline's laugh echoing across the prairie, her green eyes sparkling with mischief as she challenged him to races on horseback. The promise they'd made under the cottonwood tree, before her father's gambling debts tore their world apart. That was 3 years ago, when Judge Moorhaven had fled Millbrook Valley in the dead of night. Taking his daughter with him, now she was being sold like cattle. Colt spurred his stallion toward the town square, his mind racing faster than hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. The auction was already underway when he arrived. A crowd of ranchers and merchants gathered around the wooden platform where auctioneer Grimsby called out bids. Colt pushed through the throng, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Next item," Grimsby bellowed, consulting his ledger. Miss Evangeline Moorhaven, age 22, educated, suitable for household management or teaching. Contract labor to settle family debts. Starting bid $50. The crowd murmured with interest. Colt's stomach lurched as he spotted her being led onto the platform by two rough-looking men. Evangeline held her chin high despite the circumstances, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sun. What? But he could see the fear flickering in her eyes. As she scanned the crowd of strangers ready to purchase her future, 55 called out Jeremiah Blackthorne, the valley's wealthiest and cruelest landowner. Colt's blood boiled as he watched Blackthorne's predatory smile. 60, shouted another voice. Evangeline's gaze swept the crowd and locked with Colt's. For a moment, time stopped. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by something between relief and anguish. He saw her mouth his name silently, tears threatening to spill. 75. Blackthorne's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Colt stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square with deadly calm. $100. The crowd turned to stare at the tall rancher in dusty leather chaps and a black hat pulled low over storm-gray eyes. Whispers rippled through the assembly. Everyone knew Colt Brennigan, the man who'd built the most successful cattle operation in 3 counties with nothing but grit and determination. Blackthorne's face darkened. 125. 200. Colt replied without hesitation, though the sum represented nearly everything he'd saved. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Evangeline stared at him with wide eyes, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Blackthorne glared at Colt, clearly recognizing he was outmatched financially and in every other way that mattered. 200 going once, ... twice, ... Grimsby's gavel hovered in the air. $500, Colt called out, his voice steady as granite. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the astronomical bid. It was more money than most families saw in 5 years. Grimsby's eyes bulged. 500. Going once, twice. Sold to Colt Brennigan. As Colt stepped forward to claim his purchase and, the woman he'd never stopped loving, Evangeline's tears finally spilled over. But whether they were tears of gratitude or despair, he couldn't tell. The ride to Colt's ranch stretched in uncomfortable silence, broken only by creaking leather and horse hooves on the dusty trail. Evangeline sat rigid in her saddle, the borrowed mare keeping pace with Colt's stallion as they wound through the familiar hills of her childhood. Everything looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her circumstances. "You didn't have to do that?" she finally said, her voice barely audible above the wind rustling through the sagebrush. Colt's hands tightened on his reins. "Yes, I did. $500, Colt. That was your future, your security. You are my future." The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way that made her breath catch. She turned to study his profile, the strong jaw she'd once traced with her fingertips, the stubborn set of his shoulders that had always meant he'd made up his mind about something. Things change. People change. You don't know what I've become. He pulled his horse to a stop so suddenly she had to circle back to face him. When their eyes met, she saw the same intensity that had always made her feel like she was standing too close to lightning. "And tell me," he said simply, For a moment, she wavered on the edge of confession. But the shame was too heavy, the memories too dark, I can't. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The Brannigan ranch had grown since she'd last seen it. What had once been a modest homestead now sprawled across the valley floor, two-story house with a wraparound porch, barns that could shelter 100 head of cattle, and corrals that stretched toward the horizon. It was everything Colt had dreamed of building when they were young and foolish enough to believe love conquered all. Rosetta, Colt called as they dismounted. An elderly Mexican woman emerged from the house, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Dios mío, Rosetta exclaimed, recognizing Evangeline immediately. Little Eva, but you are so thin, Mia. Evangeline managed a weak smile. Rosetta had been the Brannigan family's housekeeper since before Colt was born, a second mother too. Him, after his parents died in an influenza outbreak. The woman's kind eyes took in everything, the hollow cheeks, the shadows under Evangeline's eyes, the way she held herself, like someone expecting the next blow. Rosetta, Evangeline will be staying with us, Colt said carefully. She need the guest room prepared, of course. Rosetta's knowing look passed between them, but she asked no questions. Come, Mia, let me feed you properly. As they walked toward the house, Evangeline caught Colt's arm. What did you tell her about my situation? Nothing, and I won't, unless you want me to. She searched his face for any sign of judgment or pity, but found only the steady warmth she remembered. It almost broke her remaining resolve. That evening, after a meal that was the first decent food she'd tasted in months, Evangeline stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Colt joined her, 2 cups of coffee. In his hands, do you remember? He said quietly. The last time we stood here together? She closed her eyes. You asked me to marry you? You said yes, before I knew what my father had done. Before I understood the kind of debts that follow a family like shadows. She accepted the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. Before I learned what men are capable of when they own you. The cup in Colt's hand rattled against the saucer. Evangeline, ... Don't. She turned away from the pity in his voice. Don't make this harder than it already is. But he caught her hand, and despite everything, her treacherous heart still responded to his touch. I meant what I said. That offer, ... it still stands. She pulled away as if burned. You bought me at auction, Colt. I'm in no position to marry anyone. Then we'll change your position. The quiet determination in his voice made her look at him. Again. In the dying light, he looked exactly like the boy who'd promised to build her a house where she could see the mountains every morning. Who'd sworn he'd love her until the stars fell from the sky. Some things can't be changed, she whispered. Maybe not. But some things can be fought for. Evangeline woke before dawn, her body trained by 3 years of harsh routine. She dressed quietly in the simple gray dress Rosetta had provided, a cast-off that was still finer than anything she'd worn since leaving Millbrook Valley. As she made her way to the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon drew her forward like a lifeline. Colt was already there, standing by the window with a steaming mug, his silhouette outlined against the pale morning sky. He'd obviously been up for hours. His hair was damp from washing, his clothes fresh. But his eyes held the weariness of a man who'd spent the night wrestling with thoughts instead of sleeping. You don't have to sneak around, he said without turning. This is your home now. No, she replied quietly, pouring herself coffee with hands that only trembled slightly. This is your home. I'm just ... temporary help. He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her step back. Don't do that. Don't pretend this is just a business arrangement, isn't it? You paid $500? I owe you 5 years of labor? That's what the contract says. Damn the contract. The mug hit the counter with enough force to slosh coffee across the wood. I didn't buy your servitude, Evangeline. I bought your freedom. She laughed, but it came out bitter and broken. Freedom? I've forgotten what that word means. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning quiet. Colt moved to the window, his posture instantly alert. We have company. Evangeline joined him and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 riders approached the house, led by a man whose presence made her skin crawl even at a distance. Vincent Carradine, her father's creditor, the man who'd orchestrated her sale, the devil who'd owned her contract before yesterday's auction. "Stay inside," Colt commanded, but she was already backing away from the window. "He's come for me," she whispered. "I should have known." "Men like Carradine don't let their property walk away." Colt's jaw hardened. "You're not property, not anymore." Strapped on his gun belt with practiced efficiency, checking his Colt .45 before heading for the door, Evangeline wanted to call him back, to warn him that Carradine was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple violence. But the words stuck in her throat. She pressed herself against the kitchen wall and listened to the conversation outside. "Renegade." Carradine's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I have nothing of yours, Carradine." "You made that clear when you sold it at auction yesterday. There was a misunderstanding." "The girl's contract has ... complications. Legal complications that void any sale." Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She should have known Carradine wouldn't let her go so easily. She'd been his most valuable, asset-educated, presentable, and completely at his mercy. "What kind of complications?" Colt's voice was dangerously quiet, the kind that required her immediate return. "I have papers properly filed with the territorial judge." The auction was premature. Through the kitchen window, Evangeline could see Colt's stance feet planted wide, hand resting casually near his weapon. She'd seen that posture before, when rustlers had threatened his cattle. It meant someone was about to discover that Colt Brennigan was far more dangerous than his calm demeanor suggested. "I have the bill of sale," Colt said. "Legal and binding." Superseded by these documents, Carradine held up a leather portfolio. "Now be reasonable. Return the girl, and I'll consider refunding half your payment." "Counteroffer," Colt replied. "Get off my land before I put you in the ground." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. One of Carradine's men shifted in his saddle, hand moving toward his gun, but Carradine raised a staying hand. "You're making a mistake, Brennigan. I have connections, influence. I can make life very difficult for a simple rancher. I have something better than connections." Colt's Colt was in his hand so fast it seemed like magic. "I've right on my side." Evangeline closed her eyes. This was exactly what she'd feared, good people getting hurt because of her father's sins. She couldn't let Colt fight this battle. For her, not when she knew what Carradine was capable of. Before she could lose her nerve, she stepped onto the porch. "I'll go with you," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just leave him alone, Evangeline, no?" Colt's voice cracked like a whip, but she was already walking toward the horses, her decision made. "It's better this way," she said, quietly as she passed him. "Some fights can't be won." But as she reached Carradine's horse, Colt's voice stopped her cold. "The lady said she'd go with you. She didn't say when." The challenge in his tone made everyone freeze. Evangeline turned back to see Colt holstering his weapon, his expression calm as mountain stone. "I propose we settle this the old way," Colt continued. "Man to man, you win, you take her. I win, you burn those papers and ride out of my valley. Forever?" Carradine's laugh was like oil on water. "You want to duel over a servant girl? I want to settle this honorably, unless you're afraid to face me without your hired guns backing you up." The insult hit its mark. Carradine's face flushed red above his beard. "Dawn tomorrow. Behind the old church. When I kill you, Brennigan, I'll take extra good care of your little dove." As the three riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, Evangeline sank to her knees in the dust, finally understanding that some men were worth fighting for, and some were worth dying for. The old church stood like a weathered sentinel on the hill overlooking Millbrook Valley, its bell tower, silhouetted against the gray pre-dawn sky. Colt arrived first, as was his way, never late, never unprepared, never backing down from a fight that needed fighting. He checked his Colt .451 final time, the familiar weight of the weapon steady in his hand. Evangeline watched from the train, her heart hammering against her ribs despite his orders to stay at the ranch. She couldn't bear the thought of him dying for her while she sat safely at home, so she'd saddled a horse before first light and followed at a distance. "Having second thoughts, Brennigan?" Carradine's voice cut through the morning silence as he approached with his two companions. The man moved with the predatory confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered to him. "Just enjoying the sunrise," Colt replied calmly. "Might be your last one." Dr. Whitmore, the town physician, emerged from behind the church with his medical bag. As the only neutral party both men trusted, he'd agreed to serve as witness and attend to whoever survived. His weathered face was grim as he nodded to both combatants. "Gentlemen," he said formally, "the terms are clear. 10 paces, turn, and fire. The survivor's claim stands without question." Evangeline, bitter-knuckled, kept from crying out as the two men took their positions back to back. In the growing light, she could see the tension in Colt's shoulders, the way his left hand hung loose and ready while his right rested near his weapon. He looked like what he was, a man who'd rather be anywhere else but would see this through to the end. "Begin the count," Dr. Whitmore commanded. 1. Colt's first step was measured, controlled. 2. Carradine moved with theatrical swagger, playing to his audience. 3. Evangeline found herself counting silently along, each number bringing them closer to a moment that would change everything. 4. The morning birds had fallen silent, as if sensing the violence about to unfold. 5. Halfway now. Evangeline pressed her hand against her mouth, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip. 6. Carradine glanced over his shoulder. A violation of dueling etiquette that made Dr. Whitmore frown. 7. Colt's pace never varied, steady as clockwork. 8. Time seemed to slow, each footfall echoing across the empty churchyard. 9. Both men's hands hovered near their weapons. Now. 10. They turned as one, but Carradine's cheating glance had given him a split-second advantage. His gun cleared leather first. The barrel swinging toward Colt's chest, the shots came so close together, they sounded like one. Evangeline's scream died in her throat as both men staggered, smoke drifting from their weapons in the still air. Carradine looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with something like surprise. His gun slipped from nerveless fingers as he dropped to his knees, then toppled forward into the dust. Colt remained upright, but Evangeline could see the dark patch spreading across his left shoulder. He holstered his weapon with his good hand, his face pale but determined. "The papers," he said quietly to Carradine's men, who stood frozen in shock. "Burn them." Now. One of the hired guns glanced at his dying employer, then at Colt's steady gun hand, and made the smart choice. He pulled out the leather portfolio and set it ablaze with a match. The legal documents curling into ash in the morning breeze, Dr. Whitmore was already moving toward the wounded rancher. "Sit down before you fall down, you fool," he muttered, pressing a cloth against the bullet hole. "Clean through the shoulder. You'll live, assuming you don't do anything else stupid today." That's when Evangeline broke cover, running across the churchyard with her skirts hiked up, tears streaming down her face. She dropped to her knees beside Colt, her hands hovering over his wound as if she could heal it with touch alone. "You magnificent idiot," she sobbed. "You could have been killed." Colt's good hand found her face, thumb brushing away her tears. "Had to be done. Some things are worth the risk. Your life isn't worth my freedom. My life isn't worth anything without your freedom." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I meant what I said 3 years ago, Evangeline. I love you. That hasn't changed. Won't change. Not if we both live to be 100. She stared at him through her tears, this man who'd risked everything for her, who'd faced down her demons without asking what they'd cost her. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some things could be redeemed. "The papers are gone," she whispered. "You're free," he confirmed. Double quotes, then ... She took a shaking breath. "Then I choose to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because I love you too. You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man." Colt's smile was brighter than the sunrise breaking over the mountains. "In that case," he said, struggling to sit up despite Dr. Whitmore's protests, "we have a wedding to plan." As Carradine's men loaded their employer's body onto a horse and rode away forever, Evangeline helped Colt to his feet. The nightmare was over. Their future was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Colt's shoulder had healed enough for him to slip his arm around Evangeline's waist as they stood before Reverend Morrison and the little church were there. Fate had been decided. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the worn wooden floor where half the county had gathered to witness their union. Evangeline had never felt more beautiful than she did in the ivory. The silk dress that had belonged to Colt's mother, carefully altered by Rosetta's skilled hands and adorned with wildflowers picked fresh that morning. The bruises on her soul were still tender, but standing beside the man who'd literally fought for her freedom, she felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. Do you, Colt Brannigan, take Evangeline Moorhaven to be your lawfully wedded wife? Reverend Morrison's voice carried clearly through the packed church. I do, Colt said firmly, his eyes never leaving her face. For better or worse, in sickness and health, forsaking all others until death do us part. The traditional words carried extra weight between them. They'd already weathered the worst separation, scandal, violence, and near death. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. And do you, Evangeline Moorhaven, take Colt Brannigan to be your lawfully wedded husband? She looked into his storm-gray eyes, seeing past the scars on his knuckles and the healing wound on his shoulder, to the boy who'd promised to love her forever. I do, with all my heart, for all my days. The kiss that sealed their vows was gentle, reverent, full of promises they both intended to keep. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, but Evangeline barely heard them over the thundering of her own heart. Later, as the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, she found herself alone with her husband on the porch of what was now truly their home. The word still felt strange on her tongue, husband, but good strange, like coming home after a long, dark journey. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Brannigan, Colt said softly. Mrs. Brannigan, she smiled at the sound of it. She's thinking about how different things might have been. If you hadn't seen that auction notice, if you hadn't had the money, if. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. We can't change the past, darling. We can only build the future. She nodded, but he must have seen something in her expression because his voice grew serious. What is it? What aren't? You telling me? For weeks she'd carried the secret, afraid that speaking it aloud would somehow make it less real. But he deserved to know, deserved to understand what their future might hold. I'm with child, she whispered. Colt's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fierce protectiveness, and finally a tenderness that made her eyes fill with tears. Are you certain? As certain as I can be. Rosetta confirmed it yesterday. She searched his face anxiously. Are you? You happy about it? Happy? He laughed, a sound of pure joy. Evangeline, you've just told me we're going to have a baby, our baby. How could I be anything but over the moon? Relief flooded through her. Given how the child was conceived, his expression darkened slightly. The child was conceived in love, even if the circumstances were complicated. Whatever happened before doesn't matter. This baby is ours, wanted and loved already, he pulled her close, careful of her still tender ribs. She breathed in the familiar scent of leather and sage that clung to his skin. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly safe. Boy or girl? He murmured against her hair. Too early to tell. What do you hope for? Healthy? Everything else is just details. He pulled back to look at her. Though I have to admit, the thought of a little girl with your green eyes and stubborn streak has its appeal, or a boy with your gray eyes and noble heart. Noble, he snorted. Darling, I killed a man 3 weeks ago. You defended what was yours. There's nothing more noble than that. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink behind the mountains that would shelter their children and their children's children. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the evening air, and somewhere, a coyote howled its lonely song to the emerging stars. Colt, Evangeline said eventually. Thank you for saving me, for believing I was worth saving. He tilted her chin up, so she had to meet his eyes. You saved yourself, Braveheart. I just gave you the chance. As they walked inside together, hand in hand, Evangeline felt the last of her old fears dissolve like morning mists before the sun. Whatever challenges lay ahead, raising children, building a ranch, carving out a life in the untamed West, they would face them as they had everything else. Together, the future stretched before them like an uncharted trail, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time in years, Evangeline Brannigan was ready to embrace it all. 5 months later, Evangeline stood in the kitchen kneading bread dough, her growing belly making the task more challenging than it used to be. Baby was active today, kicking and turning as if eager to join the bustling life of the ranch. Through the window, she could see Colt, working with the new stallion they'd purchased from a breeder in Colorado, a magnificent black beast with fire in its eyes and speed in its blood. "Mia, you should be resting," Rosetta scolded, appearing at her elbow with a disapproving frown. The doctor said to stay active, but not overdo it. Evangeline interrupted with a smile. "Besides, this little one seems to like it when I keep busy." The motion soothes him. "Him? You are so certain it's a boy?" Evangeline shrugged, placing a protective hand over her rounded belly. "Call it mother's intuition. Colt thinks it's a girl, so one of us will be right." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Rosetta moved to the window, her face creasing into a worried frown. Strangers coming, 3 of them, and they look like trouble. Evangeline's blood chilled as she recognized the lead rider, Josiah Blackthorne, Jeremiah's younger brother, and twice as mean. She'd hoped the family would leave them alone after Colt had publicly outbid Jeremiah at the auction. But apparently, the Blackthorns weren't the type to forget a perceived slight. "Get Colt," she told Rosetta urgently. But the older woman was already moving by the time Colt reached the house. Gun belts strapped on and jaw set in grim lines, the 3 riders had positioned themselves in the yard with military precision. Josiah Blackthorne sat his horse with the arrogant confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Brannigan," Josiah called out, "we need to talk." Colt stepped onto the porch, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. "Talk then, you're on my land." "No, that's what I want to discuss." Josiah's smile was cold as winter wind. "See, there's been some confusion about property lines. Turns out, this ranch sits on land that rightfully belongs to the Blackthorne family." "That's interesting," Colt replied calmly. "Since I have the deed filed with the territorial government, and my father bought this land fair and square 20 years ago, deeds can be ... challenged, especially when there are questions about the original survey." Josiah pulled out a rolled document. "This here's a new survey, properly done, showing that your eastern boundary is actually 3 miles west of where you think it is." Evangeline felt her heart sink. She'd heard of this tactic before, wealthy families using their influence to have land resurveyed, pushing boundaries to claim profitable property from smaller ranchers. Usually, the victims couldn't afford to fight back legally. "Convenient. How that puts my best grazing land and the main water source on your side of the line," Colt observed. "Convenient for us, inconvenient for you." Josiah's grin widened. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to let you buy back your own land. Say, $10,000? The sum was astronomical, more than the ranch had made in 5 years. Evangeline could see it was meant to be impossible, a way to force them off their property without the mess of outright theft. "And if I refuse?" Colt asked quietly. "Then you've got 30 days to vacate. After that, we'll be forced to ... encourage your departure." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Evangeline stepped onto the porch beside her husband, ignoring his warning look. She'd hidden behind others long enough. "There's one problem with your plan," she said clearly. "This ranch isn't just in Colt's name anymore." Josiah's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Colt said, understanding immediately where she was going, "that when I married Evangeline, I added her name to the deed. And Evangeline Moorhaven Brannigan happens to be the daughter of Judge Moorhaven, who handled the original land grants for this entire territory." Evangeline stepped forward, drawing on every lesson her father had taught her about law and politics before his gambling destroyed their family. "My father may have fled in disgrace, but his legal work stands. And I happen to remember him mentioning the Blackthorne family, single quotes, approach to land acquisition." The color drained from Josiah's face. You're bluffing, am I? I also remember the names of the federal land commissioners. We'll be very interested to hear about fraudulent surveys and coerced sales. Men who take a dim view of territorial families trying to build empires through theft. For the first time since arriving, Josiah looked uncertain. The Blackthorne family's power was local. They could intimidate county officials and territorial judges, but federal commissioners were a different matter entirely. You think your father's reputation will protect you? He sneered. A disgraced judge who ran out on his debts. No, Evangeline replied calmly. I think the law will protect us. The real law, not the version you're used to buying. Colt moved closer to her, his voice deadly quiet. You have your answer, Blackthorne? Now get off my land. This isn't over, Josiah snarled, wheeling his horse around. Not by a long shot. As the three riders galloped away, Evangeline sagged against Colt's solid strength. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she'd realized, and the baby was kicking furiously in response to her elevated heart rate. That was brilliant, Colt murmured against her hair, and dangerous as hell. What if you'd been wrong about the legal complications? I wasn't wrong. My father may have been many things, but he was meticulous about his legal work. The Blackthorns are bullies, but they're not stupid. They won't risk federal attention over one ranch. But even as she said it, Evangeline felt a chill of premonition. Men like Josiah Blackthorne didn't back down easily, and they had resources she and Colt couldn't match. The fight was far from over. It was just moving to a different battlefield. That night, as they lay in bed with Colt's protective arm curved around her growing belly, she made a silent promise to their unborn child. Whatever came next, she would never again be the helpless victim waiting for someone else to save her. She was Evangeline Brannigan now. She would fight for her family with everything she had. The attack came at dawn, just as Evangeline had feared it would. She woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of men shouting in the yard. Through the bedroom window, she could see flames licking at the barn where Colt kept his prize breeding stock. Stay here, Colt commanded, already pulling on his clothes and checking his rifle. Lock the door behind me, and don't come out until I give the all clear. But Evangeline was already struggling into her dress, her 7-month belly making quick movement impossible. I won't cower while they destroy everything we've built. You're pregnant? I'm not helpless. She grabbed the Derringer from her jewelry box, the small weapon her father had taught her to use years ago. Besides, they're not just after the ranch anymore. They're after our future, our child's inheritance. Colt's expression softened for a moment. I love your courage, but the sound of splintering wood from downstairs cut him off. They were already in the house, working together with the efficiency of a couple who'd learned to depend on each other. They barricaded the bedroom door and took positions by the windows. Below, Evangeline could see at least 6 men, all wearing bandanas to hide their faces. But she recognized Josiah Blackthorne's distinctive white hat and his brother Jeremiah's hulking frame. Brannigan. Josiah's voice carried clearly through the smoke-filled air. Come out, and we'll make this quick. Stay hidden, and we'll burn you out like rats. Colt's answer was a rifle shot that sent Josiah diving for cover behind the water trough. The siege had begun. For 2 hours, they held the house against increasingly desperate attacks. Colt's marksmanship kept the raiders at bay, but their ammunition was limited. The flames were spreading from the barn to the outbuildings. It was only a matter of time before the house itself caught fire. There, Evangeline pointed toward the eastern ridge. Riders coming fast. Colt squinted through the smoke and swore softly. More of them were finished. But as the new arrivals crested the hill, Evangeline felt her heart leap. Live. The lead rider was Sheriff Duncan Morrison Reverend. Morrison's brother and the only honest lawman in 3 counties. Behind him rode a dozen armed men, including several neighboring ranchers who'd apparently decided that what happened to the Brennigans could happen to any of them. This is Sheriff Morrison. Duncan's voice boomed across the valley. You men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully. The effect was immediate. 2 of the raiders broke cover and ran for their horses, abandoning the fight entirely. Josiah Blackthorne cursed viciously, realizing his carefully planned raid had turned into a disaster. "You can't prove anything, Morrison?" he shouted back. "These men aren't with me." "Maybe not," the sheriff replied, spurring his horse closer. "But I've got sworn statements from 3 witnesses who saw you recruiting guns in Tombstone last week. Federal marshals are already on their way to investigate your family's land claims." "You're finished, Blackthorn." Evangeline watched through the window as Josiah's face went white with rage and fear. The Blackthorn Empire was built on intimidation and corruption. Federal attention would bring it all crashing down. "This isn't over," Josiah snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "You think you've won," but his words were cut off by the sharp crack of Colt's rifle. Josiah's hat flew off his head, and he dove for cover with undignified haste. "Next." "One won't be a warning shot," Colt called out calmly. Within minutes, the remaining raiders had melted away like shadows before the dawn. Sheriff Morrison and his posse swept the area, rounding up the slower ones and putting out the fires that threatened to spread to the grassland. As the smoke cleared, Evangeline finally allowed herself to breathe. The barn was a total loss, and 2 of the smaller outbuildings were badly damaged. But the house and most of their livestock had survived. More importantly, their family had survived. "How did you know to come?" Colt asked as he helped the sheriff water his horse. Duncan Morrison spat into the dust. "Your housekeeper Rosetta is my second cousin. When she saw those men watching the ranch yesterday, she rode into town and found me. Good thing too we arrived just in time to catch them red-handed." Evangeline felt a surge of gratitude for the wise woman who'd looked after them both. "Happens now? Now the Blackthorns learn what happens when you mess with federal land grants," the sheriff replied grimly. "The territorial governor has been looking for an excuse to clean house in this county. This gave him all the ammunition he needed." 3 months later, Evangeline held their newborn son against her chest as she watched Colt rebuild the barn with help from neighbors who'd become true friends. Little James Brennigan, named for Colt's father, was perfect in every way. With his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin, he's going to be a fighter. "This one," Rosetta observed, tickling the baby's tiny fist. "Look how strong he grips." "He'll have to be," Evangeline murmured, but without the fear that once would have accompanied such words. "This is still a hard country." "But it's our country now," Colt said, appearing in the doorway with sawdust in his hair and satisfaction in his eyes. "The Blackthorns' assets were seized by the federal court last week. Their ill-gotten lands are being redistributed to the families they cheated. We're officially expanding our eastern boundary by 2,000 acres. Evangeline smiled up at her husband, this man who'd literally ransomed her from slavery and given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. "What will we do with all that land? Raise cattle? Raise children? Build something that will last for generations?" He sat beside her on the porch swing, careful not to jostle the baby. "Speaking of which, have I mentioned lately that I love you, Mrs. Brennigan, only every day since you married me?" She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the absolute security of being cherished and protected. "But I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you," he said solemnly, as if the words were a sacred vow. "I love our son. I love the life we're building together." As the sun set over the mountains that would shelter their children's children, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from the horror of the auction block to the joy of holding their child. From the darkness of servitude to the bright promise of freedom, it had been a hard road, but it had led them home. "What are you thinking about?" Colt asked softly. "Just this us, how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things." She looked down at their sleeping son. "If my father hadn't gambled away our fortune, if I hadn't been sold at that auction, if you hadn't been there to save me, we would have found each other anyway," Colt said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be, darling. Some loves are stronger than circumstance." Little James stirred in his sleep, making the soft sounds that never failed to melt his parents' hearts. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in their pastures, and the evening star appeared in the deepening sky. "Tell me about tomorrow," Evangeline said, a old game between them. "Tomorrow we'll teach our son to ride. Tomorrow we'll expand the herd. Tomorrow We'll build something beautiful on this land. And the day after that, we'll do it all again. Because we have time now, darling. All the time. In the world, as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve, Evangeline knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had everything else together. The rancher had ransomed the girl he loved, but in the end, they had both found something more precious than gold, a love strong enough to redeem the past and build a future worth leaving to their children. The story that had begun with a name on an auction block had become a legend of the American West, a testament to the power of love to conquer even the darkest circumstances and create something beautiful from the ashes of despair.